Hello, um, and welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us for today's event, Reimagining Conservation, Integrating Human Rights in the Development and Implementation of the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. My name is Ben Schachter. I coordinate the work of the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights on the right to a healthy environment, and I will be the moderator for today's discussion. Before we begin, I would like to take the opportunity to share a few logistical details with you. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available after the side event, along with a brief summary of the discussion that will be prepared by our volunteer rapporteurs, Daphne and Miriam. The webinar is also being interpreted. The interpreters will share information about this in the chat and advise participants to select the language channel that works best for them. The interpretation is English to Spanish and French. So the languages available, which you can select at the bottom of your screen, are English, Spanish, and French. Please feel free to select the option best for you. We welcome questions throughout the panel discussion, and you can raise questions by sharing them in the chat or using the raise hands function. We will come to the question and answer after we hear from our panelists, but feel free to start sharing questions whenever you like and as they come to mind. I would like to thank our co-sponsors, the Center for Justice, Governance, and Environmental Action, the Center for International Environmental Law, Conservation International, Costa Rica, Earth Justice, Forest Peoples Program, the Global Alliance of National Human Rights Institutions, Human Rights Watch, International Indian Treaty Council, the IUCN Commission on Environmental, Economic, and Social Policy, Natural Justice, Peru, the Raoul Wallenberg Institute of Human Rights and Humanitarian Law, Slovenia, Swedbio, Sweden, UNDP, UNEP, the Universal Rights Group, Women for Biodiversity, and WWF International, as well as the many colleagues and friends supporting this event, including the interpreters and volunteers. Today's discussion is intended to build momentum for integration of human rights, including the right to a healthy environment, and the development and implementation of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, to increase awareness of the linkages between human rights and biodiversity, and explore the implications of the recent recognition of the human right to a healthy environment by the Human Rights Council for Biodiversity and Conservation Action. It brings together speakers representing diverse worldviews and perspectives, including those of governments, human rights experts, environmental human rights defenders, women and girls, youth, and indigenous peoples, in support of a common objective: rights-based environmental action to protect people and planet. So now it's time that you hear from our panelists and you hear these perspectives. We'll begin today's event with video messages from the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, Francisco Khalid Sai, Indigenous Peoples representatives, and the Minister for Climate and Environment of Sweden, Annika Strandhäll. This will be followed by comments from our panelists, an interactive dialogue, and concluding remarks from the Vice President and Vice Minister of Environment of Peru, Mariano Castro, as well as a short video from the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment, David Boyd. Thank you all for joining us, and we hope you enjoy the discussion. If we could get things started now with the video from the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples.
I am honored to be part of this event on remaining conservation, embracing a human rights approach in the implementation of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. It's very much needed as state conservation efforts are often at odds with indigenous people's right to autonomy, security of land tenure, and self-determined development, and fail to respect indigenous scientific knowledge and sustainable land use practices. For centuries, indigenous people with our scientific knowledge, collective land tenure, system and sustainable management of resources have preserved and conserved our planet, providing that respecting our collective human right is a fundamental step to achieve sustainable and effective conservation goals. Regardless of our role in protecting the environment, we are often excluded from the design and implementation of environmental programs, and some states have committed acts of forced displacement, kidnapping, murders, threats, and international institutions forming protected areas and heritage of humanity, but without the indigenous peoples. For this reason, I would like to cite Article 18 and 19 of the UN Declaration on the Right of Indigenous Peoples, which recognize the right of indigenous people to participate in decision-making affecting our right to be consulted and to obtain free, prior, and informed consent in the case of initiatives affecting our rights. For these reasons, indigenous people should be directly and meaningfully involved in designing and implementing the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Particular attention should be given to the participation of indigenous women as they play a fundamental role in preserving, transmitting, applying, and developing indigenous scientific knowledge relevant for conservation.
Thank you. And following those words from the Special Rapporteur, we'd like to share with you a video on reimagining conservation. And I'd invite you now to roll that video, Amanda. Thank you. We don't appear to have the audio working. There are subtitles, but if we could get the audio, that would be great.
It's time for us to reimagine conservation. I think we've done a very good job in dialogues and talking and listening, although we could do better. But I do think it's time to take action, actual, tangible action on the ground.
Reimagino la conservación como la conservación en base a los derechos de los pueblos indígenas.
We have to acknowledge all of the historic wrongs that have been done in the name of implementing the conservation targets. Specifically, many indigenous peoples have been evicted from lands, tortured, or even killed in the course of establishing protected areas. Before we can move ahead into reimagining conservation, those wrongs must be addressed.
La conservación debe contar con ese refuerzo del aspecto espiritual. Esa espiritualidad ha sido la base para crear usos consuetudinarios, normas, regulaciones y manejo respetuoso de la naturaleza, porque sabemos que existe una conexión entre ella y nosotros.
In North America, indigenous peoples, you've probably heard the phrase, have this phrase called use all parts of the buffalo. And I think in reimagining conservation, we have to start really using all parts of the buffalo, the whole of the landscape to do conservation. You know, we need to have farms involved in rangelands and grazing lands and in our production landscapes and what have been called production seascapes into the conservation movement.
To reimagine conservation, make more visible what is wrong, what was wrongly done in the past, and correct and rectify those wrongs, and continue monitoring, the way that the targets are going to be achieved. Maybe they should include how many environmental defenders were killed or arrested or evicted. That will be a good measure of how successful you are in terms of achieving human rights and the human rights approach.
So thank you very much for that powerful video of members of the Indigenous Caucus at the World Conservation Congress on the idea of reimagining conservation. We have one final stage-setting video from Annika Strandhäll, the Minister for Climate and Environment of Sweden. And I'd invite you to roll that video now, and then we'll kick off the panel discussion.
Thank you for inviting me to say a few words as introductory remarks. It is an undisputable fact that all human beings depend on the environment in which we live. A clean, healthy and sustainable environment is fundamental for the full enjoyment of a wide range of human rights. At the same time, applying human rights can contribute in our efforts to protect the environment, such as the right to information, as well as meaningful and effective public participation. Sweden takes these matters very seriously, and I welcome this discussion today, which can help us to understand the interrelationship between human rights and environmental protection and vice versa. Furthermore, to ensure inclusive and meaningful processes and dialogues. To give some examples from Sweden, during last year we established a new Institute for Human Rights, which will be able to follow, investigate and report on how human rights are respected and realized in Sweden. Sweden has also recently decided on a consultation procedure, which will give the indigenous Sami people in Sweden increased possibilities to influence decisions which impacts them. Furthermore, Sweden has been a long-standing supporter of environmental human rights defenders in the Swedish Development Cooperation. Coordinated and concerted action is essential to confront the challenges of loss of biodiversity, climate change and pollution, and its impact on human rights. I am looking forward to today's discussions, which can hopefully inspire and pave the way for stronger focus on human rights perspectives in the upcoming CBD COP15 in Kunming. The implementation of the Global Biodiversity Framework requires a human rights-based approach and inclusive, equitable and integrative governments and a whole-of-government approaches to ensure policy coherence and effectiveness, political will and recognition at the highest levels of government. Sound environmental governance is essential, including a well-functioning judicial and enforcement system. Thank you very much for listening to me and have really good discussions now.
Thank you very much to the Minister of Sweden for those words and strong support for integration of human rights in outcomes at CBD COP15. Now I think it's time to start our conversation about how we can achieve those objectives. And so I'm pleased to begin our conversation by introducing our first panelist, Frances Agwal, who is co-chair of the negotiations of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. We're really grateful to have you joining us today, Frances. And my question to you is, how does the current draft of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework advance a human rights-based approach to biodiversity governance? And how do you think this could potentially be strengthened? Before you begin, please allow me to remind you and the other panelists to keep your initial remarks brief to 3 or 4 minutes, which will leave us plenty of time for question and answer with the audience. Over to you, Frances.
Thank you, moderator. Good day to everyone. I was hoping to have my slide shown. I don't know whether it will be displayed. But as I wait for it, since I have only about 3 to 4 minutes, yes, there it is. I'm making this on behalf of my co-chair, that is Fazil Banhab. And you can go to the next slide. So just to say here that loss of biodiversity is now, or is actually, a human rights issue, because our lives, our well-being depends on biodiversity. I don't think that any human being would exist on this planet if there was to be no biodiversity. And that's why at the beginning of creation, everything else was put there and human being was put last because we depend on biodiversity. So in terms of the rights issue, the rights approach, the rights of people in the post-2020, we are looking at an addition to the post-2020 under section B bis. And this is going to be on the guiding principles for implementing the framework. Under that, we are going to cover issues adequately on human rights. And what we are saying there is that the framework will be implemented while respecting the rights and the right to safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, the rights of IPLCs, the rights of women, girls, and youth, as well as the right to a free, prior informed consent. We are saying this is fundamental for the framework, but also aligning human rights to the post-2020, as you have heard earlier, will align the framework to other international agreements, such as the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. And this one, all parties actually observe it. So there is no contradiction there. Go to the next slide. So in the post-2020, the target that talks about human rights is actually target 21. And in it, in the interest of time, I'll read it for you. It says, ensure equitable and effective participation in decision-making related to biodiversity by IPLCs and respect their rights over land, territories, and resources, as well as the rights of women, girls, and youth. But also we have heard during the meeting we had in September last year that some parties want us to have a separate target on gender, while others are saying perhaps the language on IPLCs could be much stronger to cover aspects of land, territories, and safeguarding resources. Now, the current target, that is target 21, as you see there, is non-numerical, but we are very serious with it because we think it can guarantee 100% participation of IPLCs. So people always ask, we don't have numerical, some targets have, but this one is meant to guarantee 100% participation of IPLCs, women, girls, and youth. Now, having heard what parties said in September last year virtually, we've come up with some proposed text which parties will consider when they hold their meeting next month. And this is to ensure equitable, effective, and gender sensitive. That is just the new terminology of growth there. Gender sensitive participation in decision-making related to biodiversity by IPLCs, their rights over land, territories, and resources, as well as by women and girls and youth. So that is the slight modification that is there in target 21. Could we go to the next slide? So again, I will sum it for you here just to say that when we are talking about biodiversity loss, we're also talking about its threats for us as human beings in terms of economic stability. And we know that even the SDGs, almost all the SDGs, as you see them, they are so linked to the post-2020. So delivering the post-2020 will help us to actually achieve those SDGs. So there is no, you cannot link the achievement of the SDGs from biodiversity. So as I said earlier, biodiversity loss is a human right because our life depends on it, our well-being depends on it, including the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. So if we could go to the next slide, please. And this is how you see the link that the framework clearly shows the linkage to the delivery of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework and how it will impact on the other SDGs. So if there is a loss of biodiversity, we are saying here that those SDGs may as well be compromised. We may not achieve. So loss of biodiversity, if we continue to look at it as a side event, it means we are undermining the achievement of the SDGs. And that is why this post-2020 tries to give you that link, that you see clearly that implementing the framework contributes to achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. I think I'll end there, and if there are questions that will be asked, I will always respond to them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Francis, for sharing those reflections on the integration of rights in the current draft text, as well as some of the changes or recent suggestions from the co-chairs in that respect. That's very helpful, and I think what we'll look forward to is hearing from the other panelists and then question and answer. I do see there's already some questions in the chat. I'll just note that panelists can feel free to respond to those back in the question and answer as well, but we'll take the moment to later on to share them directly for responses, live responses too. So our next panelist is Tina Roy, the Director of Women for Biodiversity. And Tina, I'd like you to share with us your thoughts about how the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework and the process to develop it can better advance the rights of women and girls and ensure a gender-responsive approach. Over to you, Tina.
Thank you, Ben. Yeah, thank you, Ben, and thank you for all the colleagues and giving this opportunity. I definitely want to begin by saying that this is a very timely discussion, Ben, also considering that we are in the margins of having this event at the UNIA 5.2, which is looking at strengthening actions for nature to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. And in a few weeks' time, many of us will be heading to Geneva, where the post-2020 discussions are going to be taking place. So I'm just going to be broadly looking at some of the recommendations that we have actually brought forward through our report. So I think one of the first key element that we see is that we need to adopt the post-2020 Gender Plan of Action at the CBD COP15 together with the GBF to see that they both are adopted together. The first Gender Action Plan under the Environmental Convention was the UNCBD's 2015-2020 Gender Plan of Action, which is adopted by the CBD COP14 in 2014 in Pyeongchang, which advised the country pledges known as the NBSAPs, the National Biodiversity Strategies and Action Plans, should include specific activities to tackle gender inequalities and the allocation of adequate funding for support to mainstream gender issues. However, the recent review of the implementation of the Gender Plan of Action, the CBD, revealed that it has had a valuable impact in advancing actions on gender equality and women's empowerment in global efforts to implement the convention. However, to a lesser extent at the national level. So gaps still exist between the global commitments and national implementation. So how do we really address this gap and address this link of gender environment in the post-2020 is we have an absolutely great opportunity here to do better, taking on a human rights-based approach and also looking at the gender post-2020 as a whole, looking at the gender responsiveness. Gender responsiveness is one of the 13 principles for developing the global biodiversity framework. To ensure gender responsiveness, and I think following up on Francis' discussion on the possible on the 3 bis and target 21, we really need to take this opportunity to make sure that we advance on women's rights, on human rights throughout the global biodiversity framework, and not necessarily targeting only one target. Considering that the targets will be monitored through the monitoring framework with indicators. So we really do feel that we need to have a gender responsible goals, targets, and also indicators that are reflected in the monitoring framework that will guide the implementation of the post-2020. Having said that, besides target 21, which we hope will also be strengthened, to advance rights of women and girls, including Indigenous and rural women, we, through the Women's Caucus, have also been advocating for a standalone target on gender equality, Target 22. And this is also to make sure alignment with the SDGs, which has a standalone target on gender equality. Lastly, one of the key points that we also really need to make sure is that there's also a coherence between the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework and the post-2020 Gender Plan of Action. Both, again, will also be adopted at the COP15. And of course, also synergies with other MEAs. We also have the Human Rights Council decision resolutions, the UNER resolutions that have taken out the addressed human rights defenders, Indigenous women, including on environmental governance. So in the end, I think together with gender equality, the universal recognition of the right to a healthy environment by the UN General Assembly provides a historic opportunity to argue that it's time for us to advance towards gender justice in all environmental policies and planning. So that's it for me. Apologies for rushing. We also have 2 reports, including OCHR's own report of key messages, which I have it in my slide. And those also have very good recommendations, 17 key messages that builds upon these linkages, and hopefully everybody would be able to have a look at it more in detail. So thank you, and if there are any questions, I'll be happy to take them. Thank you, Ben.
Thank you so much, Tina, and really appreciate you sharing, and also both the panelists so far for keeping the remarks brief. I encourage the remaining 2 to do so as well. You all have fantastic things to say, and we want to hear more from you in the question and answer. So our next panelist is Sefa Tali from the Global Youth Biodiversity Network. And Sefa, I'd like to invite you to share with us your thoughts about how the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework and the process to develop it can better advance the rights of children and youth, including Indigenous children and youth, and in particular, their right to meaningful participation.
Yes, thank you very much, Ben. Thank you for the opportunity also to join you in this important discussion. Gawisay agaw kanda kayo amin. Good day from Baguio City, Philippines. If I may, I'll start maybe with a personal reflection on the title of today's event, on what it means to reimagine conservation. I think that before we can begin to really reimagine conservation, we need to be frank and acknowledge that business as usual mainstream conservation has failed us. Over the decades, it has played a role in creating a divide between people and nature in many people's worldview, which has caused many disastrous impacts, I believe, because the solutions were creating their own problems. For instance, as mentioned before, forest conservation has caused many Indigenous peoples to lose their ancestral lands, which is the basis of their culture and identity and survival. Or for instance, with how mainstream conservation has become a way to justify and even defend a dysfunctional economic system that is largely causing the loss of nature in the first place. So yeah, I think to reimagine conservation towards approaches that will really work, we need to go to the roots, and one of which really is what we're discussing today, which is social inequalities and human rights, which has everything to do with the biodiversity crisis, but has not been faced head-on by the conservation community. Now, to answer your question on how the post-2020 GBF can advance the rights of children and youth, first and foremost, actors in this process should listen to us and should integrate our calls into these decisions, because we will be living with the impacts of these decisions. As the Global Youth Biodiversity Network, we have engaged in this process from the beginning, and from the broad consultations that were conducted by our very active global youth community, 3 key priorities have come up for the GBF, and I'll speak to each of them briefly. So the first priority is intergenerational equity, and the full and effective participation of youth. Young people are key implementers on the ground. We have young scientists, young educators, indigenous youth, volunteers, and young professionals in conservation. We do this while carrying the burden and anxiety of the impacts of biodiversity loss on our present and our future. And many of us are also often sidelined in decision-making processes. And what we are saying is that the post-2020 GBF should uphold intergenerational equity and the right to meaningfully participate fully in the matters that affect us. This means making it a goal to ensure that future generations can enjoy a thriving nature in the future. It means respecting the precautionary principle if there are big risks to nature and people. And it means funding and supporting and measuring youth-led initiatives. This for us is intergenerational equity. The second youth priority is education, particularly quality and transformative education that can foster generations that live in harmony with nature. Quality education is a human right, and we also believe it's a very strong tool in addressing many of the root causes of biodiversity loss. Education is something that young people very much value and care about, and we are calling for education that really develops critical and caring and responsible societies. And for the GBF to reflect this, we believe we should strengthen language on integrating biodiversity into formal education and also supporting non-formal education initiatives. And the third priority is, of course, rights-based approaches for people and nature more generally. For conservation to work, we need to consider human rights as really a key thing in all things. We need to secure indigenous peoples' collective rights to our lands and waters and to help defend these against threats. We need to ensure access to justice. We need to make sure there are strong accountability mechanisms against human rights impacts. And we need to ensure that resources are flowing directly to the ground, especially to indigenous peoples and local communities, to women, to youth. And finally, we need to ensure that we support the protection and support and protect environmental defenders who really still continue to face immense and heartbreaking threats to their lives. So these three things will be key in order for the GBF to take into serious account the calls of young people. Yes, sorry if I took a bit longer, and thank you very much for your attention. Back to you, Ben.
Thank you very much, Safa, in particular for highlighting so many critical issues, including education and protection of environmental human rights defenders, among others. I hope we get to come back to some of these issues. Our final panelist is Milka Chepkur. She's the coordinator of Defending Territories of Life, the ICCA consortium, and a member of the Sangwar Indigenous Peoples. Milka, we'd love to hear from you about how the process to develop the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework can better include Indigenous peoples and advance their rights, as well as your personal experiences as a rights advocate in this context. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Ben, and thank you for having me. My name is Milka Chepkur. I am a member of the Sangwar Indigenous community, as you've heard, but maybe I would just start from a very short reflection as well of my personal life as being an Indigenous young and living in conservation protected areas here in Kenya. Is for us, when we hear conservation and when we hear the Kenya Forest Service, which is mandated to conserve our area, the first thing we do is freak out. Why? Because conservation in this side of the world means us being out of our ancestral homes and lands for conservation to happen. And so there have been evictions, a lot of evictions happening in my territory, people being evicted to create room for conservation, forest conservation, that is. And that brings us to today on how would we ever change this narrative, this notion, this fear within Indigenous people when we hear about conservation. And I think what this would do to us is to help the world change how we understand and how we define what conservation is in the first place, so that it's not just reimagining it, but redefining it. Can we define this from the indigenous people's point of view rather than whoever is defining conservation is defining? And also for us to be to acknowledge the mistakes that have happened with the protected areas in the past. When we are talking about reimagining conservation, are we taking up targets, indicators, and lessons that have picked up from a path that was leading us to a wrong direction? Of course, not a wrong direction to everyone, because I would not imagine that capitalists will feel that this is a problem. But for us indigenous people, this is such a problem. Us being evicted from our lands, for people to extract, or for governments to want to get targets to take to global platforms and say we are conserving this and this when our rights are being violated, wouldn't be the right thing to do. And so reimagining conservation then, to us at least, would mean knowing what conservation is, at least from our end. It doesn't need us going to school. It doesn't need anybody being a professor or whoever for you to know what conservation is, but it is what indigenous people and local communities have been doing for ages, to conserve the environment. And so as we're going into the post-2020, it is our hope as indigenous people that conservation can be defined in our own words and in our own way of life, and let the world learn from us rather than coming from a top-down approach. And it's no longer about language. It's no longer about how well we have captured it in this and this document, but it is about change of attitude and change of practice of what conservation is and how we want to achieve it. I think that's all that we want to say for now. And if there are questions, I'll be happy to answer. Thank you, Benjamin.
Thank you. And really important and powerful remarks about what conservation means to different people, and how we really do need to follow through on this idea of reimagining the concept in a way that reflects the different perspectives and needs and rights of people involved in conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. So now we begin the Q&A segment of our panel. We've got about a half an hour for that. There are a number of questions which have already been shared in the chat, and I will begin perhaps by posing several of those questions to Francis that were directed toward him, and then continue with the other panelists. And I also invite you to share any other reflections about what you've heard from your fellow panelists when you take the floor as well. So there was a question, there were several questions, Francis, for you related to one, the Sharm el-Sheikh Declaration for Nature and Culture, and how that could potentially be reflected in the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Two, how we can address barriers to participation in biodiversity processes. And I think that that's a question others may wish to respond to as well. And three, the new proposed guidance in the co-chair's reflection document, which you shared with us on principles including human rights, and whether or not it's sufficient to ensure effective and meaningful implementation, monitoring, and reporting of a human rights-based approach, and secure progress in this critical dimension of conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. So Francis, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, moderator. I'll try to respond to some of those. Colleagues can add as well. Now, how will the Sharm el-Sheikh Declaration on Nature and Cultures be included in the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework? I strongly believe that it is possible for this to be reflected. Maybe sometimes it is not necessarily coming out clearly in terms of words as people want to see them, but we have had lengthy discussion on this aspect of culture. Most of the time we have been drafting this text of the post-2020. And so you look at target 20, you'll find that in there, we are talking about issues to do with the traditional knowledge and then traditional practices or practice of IPLCs. Now, practices, in my view, can be interpreted in so many ways. It could as well include culture embedded in there. So the post-2020 will continue to make progress to include this issue. If it is not yet very clear, we'll try to listen to parties and see how we can, make it much more succinct. But I have to say that as co-chairs, these issues have to be raised by the parties. Otherwise, it becomes difficult for the co-chairs just to put in text there. So when we go for the resumed meeting, it will be important that parties give the co-chairs their views, where and how this thing could be integrated if target 20 is not already doing that. But I think there's elements in target 20, maybe that could be improved. And then on the issue of monitoring implementation of the human rights-based approach, something I have to say is that once we all will be in agreement that we have the human rights-based approach in the framework and the target is very clear on that, or there's a target that clearly states that, like the way we have been telling you, we are trying to improve target 21 and others, then the monitoring framework will definitely have to reflect this. And in the monitoring framework, we have what we are calling the headline indicators. So headline indicators, most of the time applies to the targets, but also the goals. So for those targets that will be including or have issues on human rights-based approach, then we expect to have at least a headline indicator. And a headline indicator is one where all parties are expected to report on. So that is how we see that human rights-based approach will be addressed in the framework. But again, like the other aspect I raised earlier, we need to make sure that parties are really on the same page with us. There were other issues raised also, moderator, the rights of nature. How are we going to consider it in the framework? Then there was, how do we handle challenges, including government policies and failure for conservation as a form of land use? So some of those, if there are other people who are going to answer them, I will leave it for them. But if not, I can give my ideas. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Francis. And let's hear from the others, and then we'll be coming back to you, I'm sure, for some additional insights. So Tina, there were a couple of questions directed toward you. One was, what can be done on impact drivers with regards to gender equality? And a second was, how can we ensure greater accountability for targets within the context of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, noting that the challenges, I think, related to the Aichi targets, and also the current context of human rights violations that are sometimes occurring in under the auspices of conservation efforts. So I think that there's elements there in those questions as well that other panelists might want to respond to, but Tina, I'm going to invite you to take a first stab at it.
Thanks, Ben, and thanks, Pooh. And I was actually writing the message on the Q&A. I totally, absolutely agree. Just as an example for everybody on the webinar, the Aichi target failed. One of the things for gender was target 14 that had very specific mention of women. However, what we did not see was reflected was the indicators, right? So there was no indicator to kind of assess how parties were going to be integrating women's rights or women's roles in achieving the Aicha biodiversity target. So I would say personally, I really feel that the GBF should have a very strong accountability mechanism. I do understand the aspiration of putting the 3 bis as a guiding para for the implementation of the GBF. However, understanding the current language, it is there. It's not a principle, but it's going to be more like a guidance, which is not, it's voluntary. So unless and until, so if you have, so that is the reason why we are asking for a very strong gender responsive target and also indicators throughout the GBF is to have some kind of a safeguard mechanism within those targets when they're going to be implemented, and also having accountability mechanism as a basic minimum. Because in the 3 bis, the aspiration is going to be that it's going to guide the monitoring, the implementation of the GBF, but because it's not tied up to being mandatory, I would say my personal reflection would be that it may miss the higher aspiration it's trying to hold in this 3 bis section. Though I'm really happy to see that mentioning, I think if it's supposed to be there, it'll be good, but those should not be taken out of the very limited space that Indigenous peoples, local communities, and women have, which is only on target 21, because it's going to be very difficult then to monitoring the implementation of the GBF after when everything goes down and everybody needs to be making or updating their NBSAPs. So I think for the process, the indicators is a very important process, which will be discussed in Geneva. I'm going to stop there, and I'll let others also speak.
Thanks a lot, Tina. And just a reminder to our audience to feel free to continue to share any additional questions. I hope that we'll have the opportunity to address a few more. I'm going to invite now Sefa to share some thoughts on a couple of the questions and issues that have been raised by comments, including Sefa, if you don't mind, a bit about the role of businesses and responsibilities of businesses in the context of this discussion. And there was another question on the limitations of the strengths and limitations of a human rights-based approach and how to address the situation when rights may conflict. And so I'd welcome your thoughts and reflections on those, as well as any of the other questions in the chat that have caught your attention that you'd like to respond to. Over.
Yes, thank you, Ben. So maybe some quick remarks on a previous question on a possible inclusion of guidance for implementation of the framework, such like a section in the preamble that refers to those. I think this section, such a section will be very important, especially in the way it's being proposed. It contains a lot of elements that we really value, like rights-based approaches, like intergenerational equity, gender responsiveness, and Indigenous people's rights. But we really would strongly insist that this should not replace the need for the explicit exclusion of such language in the targets themselves, because we need safeguards, and for safeguards to be effective, they need to be monitored and reported on, and because of that, we need them to be in selected targets so that we can create accountability for those elements. As for maybe briefly on the role of businesses, we, as an Indigenous person, our communities are still facing many big impacts of an economic system that is demanding more and more from nature, and that is just benefiting select few. This is manifesting really in what we refer to as development aggression in our areas. This is the continued perpetuation of development projects, so-called development projects, of destructive extractive industries that violate indigenous people's rights. And so these are things that we believe should be addressed also by the GBF to ensure that businesses and other actors who initiate these projects are held accountable, and that these impacts are stopped, and that indigenous people's lands are being defended from these kinds of threats. I don't recall the third question, I'm sorry, but maybe I'll just stop there for now.
Thank you, Seva. And the other question related to something posed in the chat about strengths and limitations of a human rights-based approach. So if you do want to share any thoughts on that, you're welcome to. If not, I'll invite some of the other panelists to jump in there. So I think I'll move on to ask or pose some questions to Milka, and just invite anybody on our panel to raise their hand if they do want to jump in and respond to anything else. And I'll flag that we'll be coming back to the panelists to share any closing reflections after we've gone through the Q&A. Additional questions are still welcome. We do have a bit of time for that. And you know, if no further questions are posed, then we'll jump back to the panelists for any concluding reflections. So Milka, there are a number of questions related to land use and the importance of securing the recognition of the rights to traditional lands, resources, and territories for indigenous peoples and local communities, and why that hasn't been done yet, given the conservation benefits, and what the challenges are to securing land recognition, and how government policies can address that. So if you could try to answer some of those questions or address some of those issues, that would be very welcome. And then there was another question about the rights of nature, and how how to reflect on rights of nature in the context of this discussion of human rights, and welcome your thoughts on that if you have any, and also from other panelists. Over to you, Milka.
Thank you very much, Benjamin. On tenure rights for indigenous people, I think the problem really has been the conflict between businesses and governments doubting indigenous people's ability to conserve. And this is mainly something that has been borrowed from the fortress conservation paradigm, which equates conservation to no human occupation. And you find this being a problem with most of the countries in the South, because our governments just adopted colonial regimes of what conservation is. And that takes us back to what I was saying previously on us, the need to redefine what conservation is in the first place. So you can imagine how much struggle governments get into to adopt to a different, which is more realistic paradigm of acknowledging that conservation and people are one, and that there's no division between what the rights of nature, we would say, and the rights of people. They are all intertwined, and people will exist for nature to exist, and we are nature anyway. And dividing that is what makes governments to, and many other people, of course, even those who are non-Indigenous, to struggle why Indigenous people would want to stay in their territories, why Indigenous people say that they can conserve when conservation has been equated to people being in uniforms and having guns and fencing conservation areas, you see. And this is what is leading to the delayed or even sometimes the denial of tenure rights to Indigenous people. And of course, how to address that would be this framework to look at conservation, like I said, not from what it was before or what it has been, creating protected areas and protecting them from the people who the land belongs to and who have been conserving, to do something else that we don't know what it is, and it is called conservation from a definition of someone else. I think I have also said something about the rights of nature, but I would want to repeat again that I hope that someday human beings will not see themselves as, more special than a tree, than fish, than any other thing in the world, because we are nature and nature is us. Without any of us, none of us exists. Actually, the world would exist better without us human beings. So separating that will get us into more conflicts between people, because people will be, fighting for resources, would want to make more money. Governments would want to get more grants for conservation, and they would want to create more protected areas. So we will get into more problems, and during the conflict, we lose more biodiversity that we think we would conserve. Yeah, I think those would be my remarks for now then.
Thank you very much, Milka, for that. And I'll just point out there is another question in the chat, which I welcome anybody to respond to in their sort of concluding remarks, which relates to the rights of workers, where conservation brings about job losses. So what I'd like to do now is pose some final questions to our panelists. Really grateful to you all for the excellent presentations and contributions so far, and invite you to reflect on the question I posed, but also to share anything else you would like in terms of concluding remarks. And we will start with Francis. Francis, if I could ask you, sorry, not sure what, I think maybe we just had an audio hiccup. I'll carry on.
I can hear you. I can
Great.
hear you. Yeah. So you
Perfect.
wanted to say something? Okay.
Yeah, if I may, Francis, we'd love to hear from you a little bit more about next steps and the development of the framework and how these could be informed by human rights, including in the context of targets and indicators for follow-up implementation and reporting, and any other reflections you might wish to share with us in closing. Thank you very much, Francis.
Yeah, thank you so much, and thank you for organizing this. Every time we speak, we get the opportunity to listen to this post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. This is a framework that should have been there now, up and running, but unfortunately, events that happened couldn't allow it to be adopted then. So we have continued to work, but I think also that length of time that we have all gone through has given us time to reflect on what this framework should be like, what we want to be prepared. So in terms of the next course of action in the development of this framework, we are going, of course, to have the resumed meeting, which is scheduled from 13th to or 14th to 29th March in Geneva, Switzerland. And the meeting is going to be concurrent, like almost the COP arrangement. You are going to have SAFTA, we are going to have SBI3, we are going to have the post-2020 as well happening at the same time. So it means that people have to strategize and see how they participate in those meetings. Now, for us as co-chairs, really, we would love to see a text that is clean, because draft one has no square brackets. So if we are going to end up with so many square brackets in draft one, means that the discussion at COP15 is going to be very, very difficult. So we need to try to resolve most of the matters that we could be having either divergence on when we are in Geneva. If possible, let's have just a clean text of post-2020. If must be there some few paragraphs with the square brackets, very few of them. Because the more we take to disagree on the post-2020, biodiversity loss is not waiting at all. It's just continuing. So we need to reflect on that. And as we have said, biodiversity loss is a human rights issue. How comes we all know the importance of biodiversity, but we'll continue to disagree on the text of post-2020? So that's why we are hoping that things will happen well there. Then secondly, also there's the issue of digital sequence information, for which the discussion also happening in parallel with the development of the post-2020. So the open-ended working group again has to agree on the text, on the recommendation, on DSI that will go to COP for adoption. So from there, then the co-chairs will see how to bring on board issues of DSI with the post-2020. So those are the two processes that the co-chairs are handling at one go. So for the colleagues here, I think the best you need to do is to see how you bring up your issues to parties and engage them and see where you want it to be put, so that when you raise them on the floor, it is supported. You shouldn't surprise parties with your statements. Then it goes begging, whereas it is very good. But then co-chairs asks, anybody supporting that submission? No one. Then the co-chairs are also handcuffed. So please be interested in this process. See how fast you can engage parties and see how the issues could be addressed. I think that is what I can say now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Francis, for that. And now I'd like to invite Tina to share with us any final reflections, as well as recommendations for targets and indicators for follow-up implementation and reporting, and sort of final thoughts on the idea of a standalone target on gender responsive action. Thank you, Tina.
Yeah, thank you, Ben. I think I've already given my recommendations, but I'm happy to share again. So we really want to make sure that the GBF is inclusive, is based on human rights. It also means that including recognizing the rights of women and girls. And this is also particularly because the GBF is going to be a very big debate. We're also recognizing that this GBF is a 30-year plan. Once it's set, I mean, there's a middle of a stock tick, but there isn't going to be much work around revisiting the targets or the indicators. So that's why I think we really feel that we need to have a standalone target on gender equality. It's about time. I mean, we have so much work on women's rights happening. We have so much of information meetings taking place, recognition of the rights. And I just hope that request to the parties, to allies, to say that, this is something that needs to be adequately addressed in the GBF, in coming in Geneva and also in the COP15. In the ending, I also want to say, thank you for putting up this interesting webinar, also tying it up with the UNIA 5.2 meeting, which is taking place currently. So if colleagues are there joining from Nairobi who are attending the meeting, it's also really very relevant to look at the work and look at this synergy that I mentioned before. Because right now, what you're talking about protected areas, you talk about conservation, you talk about sustainable production, consumption, rangeland, these all are being discussed at UNIA right now. And what I see right now, there isn't much language on human rights that's being discussed. So I think UNIA is taking place before the CBD meeting in Geneva. And I just also hope that, I would feel that the CBD COP decisions would actually pave the path for these other processes, and hopefully not the other way around. So I'll kind of end at that. And yes, if there's anything.
Thank you so much, Tina. And I see Francis has a hand up. Francis, did you want to share something else?
Yeah, just a little bit to add to what the speakers just said about I think the time frame, the framework. Yes, the goals are the ones that will run to 2050, but the targets, as you see, we have the action targets to 2030. So that means beyond 2030 or 2031 to another 2040, the targets might be looked at and may perhaps adjusted if needed be, but the ones that should be long-term to drive us through are those goals. They're for 2050. So that is just the little bit I wanted to add there regarding the framework itself.
Thank you, Francis. Appreciate those additional thoughts, and I think it is important we all bear in mind the timelines and really how important the outcomes at CBD COP15 will be for long-term conservation efforts. I'd like to now invite Sefa to take the floor and share any final reflections, including if you like, Sefa, on the question of how the framework can address better Indigenous and community conservation areas, and any other or further thoughts on opportunities for meaningful participation of youth. Over to you.
Yes, thank you, Ben. Thank you again also for the opportunity to join. First, speaking as an Indigenous youth, I do also just want to briefly emphasize something that was mentioned many times and also in the chat, but really needs to be repeated. Indigenous peoples, including Indigenous youth, have always been leaders in conservation in their communities as a way of life. I think that we need to really understand that that one of the most effective ways to support nature is to support these communities, to secure their lands and territories, and for them to be able to govern these areas on their own terms through Indigenous and local systems of governance, through Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous practices, which are very rich and which really have been rooted in a deep connection to the land since time immemorial. Just as an example, in our communities, we live by the words Tidagakit Biag, or in English, land is life, because we know that our survival and the survival of future generations depends on the land. And so we must sustain it and nurture it. This for us is conservation. And finally, to summarize my earlier remarks on how the GBF can listen to youth, we strongly believe that the post-2020 framework should integrate intergenerational equity, education, and rights-based approaches, including children's rights, but not just as text. We really need these to be implemented on the ground and measured for accountability. And from our assessment, this is the framework as it is now is still lacking in this regard. And so this is also a call for the next negotiations moving forward to remedy this towards creating a better future for the next generations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sefa. And I'd like to now turn things over to Milka for her concluding remarks. And Milka, I hope you can build a little bit on what Sefa has shared with us already, and share some reflections on the importance of addressing Indigenous and community conservation areas in the context of the post-2020 biodiversity framework, and perhaps what that would mean as well for your community. Over to you, Milka.
Thank you, Benjamin. Of course, what Sefa just shared with what I'm going to share is an experience of all Indigenous people, whether young or older. But what really we hope that this next step would do for us, just carrying on from what she said, is that we can be able to see a difference between what conservation has been and what conservation will be into the future. And so the indicators that should come out there would be those that will address issues that have happened in the past, because it doesn't make sense for us to just assume that we are all good and we can, just say we redefined conservation from this area, or we are doing the framework from this point going forward and saying, hooray, we are doing conservation. No, I think the thing to do is to have indicators that we show how governments, how organizations, conservation organizations, and how everybody has been able to address issues that have happened in the past, be they injustices related to land, injustices related to eviction of communities from their lands for conservation reasons, and help towards addressing the tenure security for Indigenous people. And of course, picking up from that is for governments to be able to report on how much protection they've been able to give to their Indigenous occupants in their countries in terms of protecting their rights to their lands, their human rights, their rights to life. And of course, I'm saying this really reflecting back to my community, having been people who have been evicted for so many times to create conservation areas and expanding protected areas. That would really be good if our government could come back and report on having recognize our rights, having secured or protected our rights to land, our rights to health and water and everything like every other human being. I would tell you all with, a lot of sadness that we have lost some of our community members during evictions. And it is just, an activity that maybe the government is doing to want to prove to the world that they are conserving more areas. So why would we want to say that we are securing rights to clean water and health and everything for everybody else, but killing Indigenous people who have been protecting the same area? So I think, a change in all this, especially in practice, rather than just looking at what the text says, change the practice. Do not hold on to colonial ways of what conservation is and treating Indigenous people as less humans. And, imagine that in the next 30, 20 years, we will have conservation achieved. It's not going to work unless we really recognize the rights of Indigenous people to life, to land, to water, to every other right that every other a human being is entitled to out there. Unless we do that, then we wouldn't be having any reason to really fight for conservation of biodiversity. Thank you.
Thank you, Milka. And really, I think it's important that our audience does understand the repercussions of conservation done wrong, and we can't change and transform our relationship with nature and our approach to conservation unless we fully understand those lessons and make a commitment to avoiding the mistakes of the past and taking a rights-based approach to conservation. So I think that concludes our panel discussion. We have honored guest with us to share some concluding remarks. I just want to check before doing that with you, Francis, if that's a new hand or if that's the hand from previously. Francis, is that you?
I think that's the hand, sorry. It's the hand from the previous, sorry.
Okay, no problem at all. Thank you very much to all of our panelists for their excellent insights and powerful insights into a rights-based approach to conservation. With the last minutes of our discussion here today, I'd like to invite the Vice President and Vice Minister of the Environment of Peru, Mr. Mariano Castro, to share with us his reflections on the discussion and on the way forward for a rights-based approach to conservation. And following his remarks, we have a brief inspirational video from the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Environment to send you all on your way. So with that said, over to you, Vice Minister Castro. Thank you.
Muchas gracias por la oportunidad y un saludo a todas y todos los que participan en este foro, así como también a los panelistas anteriores, ¿no? Que me permite en primer lugar hacer una reflexión inicial sobre el enfoque de derechos considerando esas intervenciones. Quiero destacar que el enfoque de derechos tiene como sentido el de no solamente la obtención de los derechos, sino un enfoque en el cual se busque un proceso en el cual se desarrollan capacidades de los gobiernos y de las personas para que tengan mejores condiciones de cumplir sus roles por parte de los gobiernos para la satisfacción de esos derechos, así como también de las personas para que éstas puedan acceder a los derechos de diverso tipo. Esto, además, que es ya vigente hace muchos años, ¿no? Dentro del sistema de Naciones Unidas, los panelistas nos han hecho notar de que este enfoque de derechos debe considerar las características y particularidades de los jóvenes, de las mujeres, el enfoque de género, de los pueblos indígenas. Cada uno de estos sectores tienen particularidades y condiciones que deben ser reconocidos de forma específica. Para obtener estos derechos, si se tiene una aproximación neutra, es decir, sin considerar estas particularidades, no vamos a poder conseguir los resultados deseados. Entonces, estas características específicas que nos han dicho claramente a las jóvenes, a los representantes de pueblos indígenas, la perspectiva de la mujer, etcétera, resultan fundamentales tener esa precisión. Ahora, junto con ello, quiero destacar que esta situación en la cual debemos enfrentar, que constituye los elementos que hoy día configuran situaciones de crisis a nivel planetario, ¿no? Y que están vinculadas con la contaminación ambiental, el cambio climático, la pérdida de biodiversidad, afectan en forma directa la vigencia y la realización de los derechos humanos. Esta situación no es clara para todos, ¿no? Porque existe en nuestros países y también dentro de los esquemas y acuerdos internacionales, algunas veces existe que hay una vía destinada a lograr la vigencia de los derechos ambientales y climáticos, y otra vía para la vigencia de los derechos humanos, como si no estuvieran interconectados y como si no estuviesen merecer igual atención. De ahí la importancia, entonces, de que le demos la prioridad en las políticas ambientales y climáticas y también en las políticas sobre vigencia de derechos humanos, le demos importancia a lo que es la justicia ambiental. De tal manera de que de esa manera podemos efectivamente establecer los vínculos y las sinergias, no solamente para garantizar la satisfacción de las necesidades esenciales para toda la persona, sino también enfrentar estos problemas ambientales globales que he mencionado. Este vínculo es fundamental. Y hay ejemplos muy concretos y palpables, ¿no? En donde vemos cómo la contaminación afecta gravemente la calidad de vida, la calidad de recursos hídricos, perdón, así, el derecho al acceso al agua, ¿no? Entonces, o que la pérdida de biodiversidad afecta igualmente la reducción de pesquerías, afecta el derecho al trabajo, afecta el desarrollo de cientos de comunidades pesqueras, por mencionar apenas uno de los ejemplos. Existe entonces esta vinculación muy concreta, ¿no? Y que quiero destacar además de que ya en la conferencia de Río de 1992, todos los países acordamos, entre otros principios, el principio 10, ¿no? Que como recordamos tiene que ver con este enfoque en donde para asegurar el cumplimiento de los objetivos de la política ambiental es fundamental que asegurar por parte de los estados el derecho al acceso a la información, el derecho a la participación y el acceso a la justicia ambiental. Ese principio 10 es fundamental vincularlo con la cuestión que estamos señalando, porque nos permite entonces desarrollar también un enfoque programático, ¿no? Orientado a asegurar el acceso a estos derechos para que con el concurso de todos podamos efectivamente enfrentar los problemas ambientales locales y globales. En el caso de América Latina y el Caribe, hemos logrado recientemente acordar y que entrar en vigor el acuerdo de Escazú, que precisamente está destinado a estas materias, ¿no? Y que constituye una herramienta fundamental para el fortalecimiento de la democracia ambiental en América Latina y el Caribe. Pero además de esto, que ya es de por sí relevante porque además constituye el primer acuerdo ambiental regional que aborda estas cuestiones y que respondiendo así a las características y necesidades y prioridades de los países de América Latina y el Caribe. Además, este acuerdo trae un componente importante que no tienen otros acuerdos similares, que es la protección de los defensores ambientales. Esto es fundamental porque efectivamente se requiere que adoptemos medidas afirmativas para que las personas defensoras ambientales frente a esta crisis que hemos mencionado, ambiental y climática, puedan contar con medidas reales de protección que garanticen su derecho a la vida y la libertad frente a situaciones de riesgo. Y en ese sentido quiero destacar además ya que no solo que este esfuerzo a nivel regional, que es relevante y que próximamente se va a realizar la primera conferencia de las partes, sino que en el caso de Perú quiero señalar de que hemos establecido mecanismos multisectoriales de protección de personas defensoras de derechos humanos, no solamente ambientales, de los derechos humanos, incluyendo lo ambiental. Y además, esto es fundamental porque se requiere en el territorio y en las zonas donde hay estos problemas, pues se atraviesan varios derechos de pueblos indígenas, de mujeres, de derechos de género, derechos ambientales, problemas de afectación de tierras, etcétera, y en consecuencia se requiere una actuación multisectorial. Pero en particular, y además, también hemos aprobado un protocolo para personas defensoras de derechos ambientales, estableciendo mecanismos específicos para asegurar que se puedan realizar medidas de carácter preventivo, ¿no? Así como también que alude, por ejemplo, vamos a publicar prontamente el primer informe sobre la situación de personas defensoras ambientales, ¿no? Y otras medidas preventivas que tienen que ver con la identificación de las situaciones de riesgo, pero también medidas de reconocimiento, para que se distinga y se estimule, se incentive la actuación de los y las defensoras ambientales. Y también medidas de protección, que aluden a lo que son las medidas de protección vinculadas al sistema de fiscalización ambiental, así como también medidas de protección vinculadas a poder movilizar a las personas afectadas, ¿no? Y que puedan ser evacuadas de la zona de riesgo. Pero también se ha establecido mesas regionales, ¿no? Así como también un grupo de trabajo de diversas agencias y delegaciones de países que tienen presencia en el Perú, puesto que sabemos que estas dimensiones de los derechos ambientales tienen también un carácter transnacional y que requiere acciones de cooperación efectivas, ¿no? Quiero terminar señalando de que esta necesidad entonces de generar mayores sinergias entre las políticas de conservación de biodiversidad, las políticas vinculadas al cambio climático, entre otras, incluyan y prioricen las cuestiones de la justicia ambiental en sus diversas dimensiones, porque el no enfrentar los delitos ambientales, el no enfrentar las amenazas de los defensores ambientales, debilitan o inclusive ponen en riesgo la posibilidad de cumplir los objetivos de las políticas que hemos mencionado. Y en ese sentido, el enfoque de derechos humanos es fundamental que se integre de manera transversal como parte de las acciones programáticas que conllevan a combatir los efectos, repito, del cambio climático, de la reducción y pérdida de biodiversidad y la contaminación en general. Entonces hay una íntima relación y que debemos considerar además las particularidades de cada sector de la población, las y los jóvenes, el enfoque de género, los pueblos indígenas, entre otros sectores que tienen una condiciones de vulnerabilidad especial frente a estos problemas. Muchas gracias. Estos son mis comentarios que a partir de lo que he escuchado y lo que en el Perú estamos impulsando, quería compartir con ustedes.
Thank you very much, Vice Minister, and we're extremely grateful for your comments and reflections, including with respect to the important issues of participation and protection of environmental human rights defenders and taking a human rights-based approach to conservation and environmental action. We have a final video that we'd like to share with you from the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Environment. At the conclusion of that video, we'll conclude the event. We're running just a couple of minutes over time, but I do want to take one last opportunity to thank everybody on behalf of all of our co-sponsors and to really thank our co-sponsors and the audience today for joining us. It's been an excellent and exciting discussion, and I'd invite you now, Amanda, to share the video from the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Environment.
Hello, I'm Dr. David Boyd, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment. Let me briefly address two reasons why human rights are so essential to the conversation about biodiversity. The first reason is universal. All human rights ultimately depend on healthy ecosystems and biodiversity. Think of pollinators and the right to food, plants producing the oxygen essential for the right to life, and healthy forests that protect us from zoonotic diseases, protecting the right to health. The second reason is that too often in the past, conservation actions have violated human rights, evicting people from their homes and communities, criminalizing traditional lifestyles, even inflicting acts of violence against indigenous people and members of local communities, simply for trying to exercise and defend their rights. I hope that we can all agree that in the 21st century, this is completely unacceptable. On the other hand, rights-based approaches to conserving, protecting, and restoring biodiversity are the only effective and equitable way to save nature and save humanity from the global biodiversity crisis. So I have three quick but vital recommendations. Number one, rights-based approaches should be highlighted and incorporated throughout the global biodiversity framework. Human rights should be front and center in legislation, national biodiversity strategy and action plans, processes to create or expand protected areas, and in their planning, management, and enforcement. Conservation finance must be carefully screened to ensure investors respect, protect, fulfill, and promote human rights. Number two, the rights of indigenous peoples and other rural rights holders should be prioritized. Not only free, prior, and informed consent, although that's important, but more broadly, the title, rights, and governance responsibilities of indigenous peoples and other rural rights holders must be incorporated in law, implemented, and respected. And third, the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, recently recognized by the UN Human Rights Council, should be incorporated, as well as measurable targets related to its implementation. Recognizing this right empowers everyone, including children, youth, and women, to engage in nature conservation that protects both human health and ecosystem health. We know that rights-based approaches to conservation work. Lands where indigenous peoples' title and rights are recognized are high in biodiversity. In Namibia, community conservation areas are creating larger wildlife populations, economic benefits, and increased human well-being. A marine protected area near Cabo Pulmo in Mexico, designated at the request of the local community, has helped to rebuild fish populations and generated a thriving tourism sector. Indigenous protected and conserved areas in Canada and Australia are protecting biodiversity, reviving cultures, and generating economic benefits for Indigenous peoples. In conclusion, based on international and national law, putting human rights at the heart of conservation is an obligation, not an option for governments. Thank you very much.
So with those words from the Special Rapporteur, we will conclude today's session. Just wishing you all attending the UN Environment Assembly in Nairobi successful discussions and outcome, and looking forward to continuing our discussions with you in the context of the negotiations of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, which will be taking place starting March 14th here in Geneva. And we look forward to continuing to be in touch on this. And thanks again to everybody for an excellent discussion. Goodbye.
Thank you, bye.
Thanks, Ben and everybody. Good night.
Thanks, Tina. Night.